Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Mailbox for the 5th of September 2012. My name is TotalBiscuit, bringing you your daily dose of community interaction, gaming discussion, and all that good stuff. You can email in mailbox@cynicalbrit.com, that's mailbox@cynicalbrit.com, with topics for future shows. The game in the background is Counter-Strike Go, once again playing a little bit of Arms Race. I think this is going to end up being my game for a little while. First email comes in here from Noah R. that says, "What are your opinions on Orcs Must Die's latest DLC called Fire and Water Booster Pack? I, like many others including you, greatly enjoyed Orcs Must Die 2 and have found dozens of hours of entertainment at the very reasonable price of $15. Recently though, Robot Entertainment, creators of Orcs Must Die 2, have released a new DLC which includes 6 new levels, 3 new traps, and a couple of new enemy types. This DLC, however, is $5, a third of the original price. The amount of content offered is clearly not one-third of the original, as the main game includes dozens of levels, dozens of traps, and dozens of weapons, spells, and trinkets. As such, the price of this DLC and the amount of content is nowhere near close in proportion to what the base game offers. My question is it okay for developers to charge unproportional prices versus content? Furthermore, what are your opinions on content versus price in general? Do you think there are some overarching standards that dictate how much content must be offered for a price, or is it purely subjective for each and every gamer?" Well, not only is it purely subjective for each and every gamer, I would say that it's purely subjective for each and every game. If all games had just a single price point and all games were fairly similar in terms of length and style and genre, then it would be fairly easy to determine what would be an acceptable amount and what would not. If every game was 10 hours long, if every game was $10, then if you offer 2 hours of content, then you'd think it would cost $2 in a DLC, right? Well, no, it's not that easy. The main problem with Orcs Must Die 2, and I'm not saying this is a problem with the game per se, it's just that it causes problems for DLC later down the line, is that it's a lot of content for not an awful lot of money. That's then muddied by the fact that while I fully endorse Orcs Must Die 2, and I think it's absolutely fantastic, it is an astonishingly good game, it is also very similar to the original. It's better. It's a sequel in the older sense of the word. Back in the day, sequels just tended to be more of the same. Doom and Doom 2 are a great example. There's not a huge amount of changes there, but yet you would say that Doom 2 is a reasonable sequel to Doom, right? Well, you would certainly think so. New weapons, new enemies, new levels, couple of new features. That's a sequel. Or at least it was. These days, it does seem like an awful lot of people want more from a sequel. They either want a complete reinvention, or they want a very significant advancement. And then, of course, there's the argument of how much do you reinvent the wheel? If people liked Game 1, how much do you change it in Game 2? Probably not a huge amount, because if you do, then, of course, you end up alienating your core fanbase in the first place, so that's a bit of a problem. Second problem with Orcs Must Die is, as I was pointing out, the price point, $15. As you said, it's a very reasonable price. So does that mean that you should then expect to pay more for DLC later down the line? Was it launched at that price point because they then wanted to sell you DLC later? That is something that has become increasingly common lately. You've got games that are initially launched at a low price as essentially a platform for DLC. It's almost like treating a game as a service. That's, of course, the entire principle of free-to-play gaming, although when you pay a low price for a game, you generally expect more content than you would from just getting a free-to-play game, unless, of course, the name happens to be TF2 or Blacklight Retribution. The thing is, they gave you that. They gave you the content that you would expect for $15. As you said, dozens of hours of entertainment, $15, really great game. And then they give you a $5 DLC. Well, I'll say, I think from a business standpoint, it's pretty dumb, but then again, I can see reasons why you would do it. If you engender a lot of goodwill as a result of producing a thoroughly fantastic game, you build a fan base, then you can probably get away with it. The thing is, should you really be getting away with it? If you build a lot of goodwill, do you really want to throw all of that away for the sake of one expensive DLC pack? Is that beneficial to you? What are you willing to trade it for, I suppose? In my opinion, $5 is probably not a reasonable price for this on the basis of what you've just said. It's not a lot of extra content, and yet it's disproportional in terms of how much you're paying. The thing is, that's very common for DLC in general. It's even arguably common for many expansion packs. You're never necessarily going to get the best value from a DLC pack, but it's going to vary on a game-by-game and, of course, DLC-by-DLC basis. And then, of course, it's not necessarily even about the amount of content, it's about the quality of the content and what's actually in there in the first place. It's Good example, actually, would be Saints Row 3. None of the DLC for Saints Row 3 has essentially been amazing. It's more often than not been a little bit short for the amount that you're actually paying for it. That could arguably be a problem, but then again, people also want stuff like gangsters in space. In the case of Orcs Must Die 2, I don't think it actually adds with the Fire and Water DLC booster pack the things that I would really want if I was going to pay $5 for it. I think with stuff like level packs and trap packs and little bits of enemies, anything that doesn't really change the game dramatically, you should be charging a couple of dollars for it. And then, of course, you will end up selling more anyway. It's not like you're saying, oh, well, I've got to sell 10 times as much. No, just cut that price in half, $2.50. Then you've got to sell twice as many. Chances are you will anyway, because your price point is actually a lot lower and you don't leave a bitter taste in the mouth of your player base. That said, Robot's never really been particularly good with its DLC pricing, honestly. Orcs Must Die, the original, also had some DLC that some would argue was not really worth it. Not to mention, of course, the Hero Academy debacle. It's like, this is a great game and I really want to recommend it, but the pricing is completely off in comparison to the iOS version. So I would say, when it comes to DLC, shoot low for the price point and look for volume of sales, because at the end of the day, you then engender more goodwill in your player base, and they will be willing to continue to support you throughout the rest of your post-launch cycle. This one comes in right here from Stampy Longnose that says, I was wondering what your opinion was on what Corey Davis said about the Spec Ops multiplayer. It's obvious to immediately blame 2K for forcing a rushed multiplayer, but I understand it may have ultimately allowed for more sales. How do you think you could strike the right balance between creative freedom and sellability? Well, ultimately, sellability is not a real word, but hey, we'll go with it. I understand what you mean. The idea is if you tack multiplayer onto your title and you have it as part of your feature checklist, as was accurately described in the article, then you may sell more copies. It should be fairly obvious at this point that multiplayer has been on the rise for the last few years in gaming, and as a result, I think we have seen a decline in the quality and length of single-player titles. Call of Duty, for instance, the original Call of Duty was very much focused on the single player and had a lengthy and extremely cinematic, very well put together campaign. Now, if you were to compare that to, say, Modern Warfare 3, whose campaign can be beaten in under 4 hours and is highly linear, to say the least, then I've got to say that it should be obvious that the focus has shifted to multiplayer. I don't necessarily have a problem with that, but as far as I'm concerned, if something is tacked on, it shouldn't be in the game anyway. With Spec Ops in particular, the point that Corey Davis is making is that Spec Ops single player was kind of a deconstruction of all of the war porn stuff that we've been seeing in gaming over the last few years. It had a solid, if mediocre, set of game mechanics. It used reasonable but not spectacular cover shooting in order to get through the game, but that wasn't really the point. The point was the story, the point was the horrible things that you saw, the experiences, and watching these troops descend into what was essentially a more of madness and have it affect their psyches and watch real character development going on, the kind of character development that you don't really see outside of lengthy RPGs. You certainly don't usually see it in a third-person shooter with a 6 to 8 hour campaign. Now, I wouldn't say that the multiplayer was bad. I think from a strictly mechanical perspective, it was solid, if not spectacular. I played it, I enjoyed it for what it was, but it was almost like playing an entirely different game. It was like, well, what's the theme? What is the point of this being part of Spec Ops: The Line? This could just be any other game. Now, here's the one criticism I would level at Corey Davis. I do, for the most part, agree with what he's saying. It was outsourced multiplayer. It was accurately described as a tick box. 2K demanded it was there, and it was, quote, a low-quality Call of Duty clone in third person. Yeah, essentially it was. I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I got a couple of hours of fun out of it, but here's the weird problem with what he's saying. He said this was all tacked on. Yeah, true, okay. But I'd also like to point out that his game was only 6 to 8 at maximum hours to actually play through the campaign, and didn't really have an awful lot of replayability. In fact, I would say, as a result of the very heavy emphasis on character development, as well as the storyline twists and turns and horrific things that go on, when you play it the second time through, you're pretty much desensitized to all of that and nothing can really shock you anymore. As a result, it doesn't really have any replayability. And as a result, I would then say you're trying to charge $60 for a 6 to 8 hour game. The multiplayer actually was a tick box for 2K, because if they didn't have it, then most people would have turned around and said, this game isn't worth it. Even with the multiplayer, a lot of people said, it's a 6 to 8 hour game with middling mechanics and this amazing story and everything. But is it good value? Well, it's really debatable, honestly. I think that a lot of people played through it and said, I probably didn't get my value for money here. So, at least with the multiplayer, you can play that, get a few more hours out of it. Maybe you get into it. Maybe you get in a little organized fire team and you actually have a bit of fun with it. Because the game works fairly well if 2 or 3 of you work together to cover all angles. And it can be quite tense. It's not terrible. It's just not really exceptional in any way. I've got to say this to a dev. If you are going to release a game that has a 6 to 8 hour campaign with no replayability, you probably shouldn't be charging $60 for it. Quite frankly, it seems like 2K knew that, which is why they tacked the multiplayer on and had it outsourced to another studio, because if you didn't have multiplayer, and then you try and sell this for $60, a lot of people will just say, well, no. It's not good value. You're competing with a lot of games that have a hell of a lot more content than that. You need something to beef it out, and if it's not going to be your story, then multiplayer kind of becomes the only option there. To conclude, I can definitely see why Corey Davis is upset about it, and his points are valid, but at the end of the day, it's also about providing a good, well-rounded package for consumers, and at $60, a 6-hour campaign just doesn't cut it. This one comes in from Cyborg T that says, I was wondering what you think about the recent disqualification of teams Curse and Dignitas from the MLG LoL tournament in Raleigh. I read an article that said they conspired to split the prize money after one of them threw the game, though no details were given as to who was planning to lose. Obviously, if these details are correct, then both teams deserve their disqualifications, but what interests me is the idea that they conspired to split the tournament reward after the match. I was wondering what you think about the idea of top teams conspiring prior to the match to split the reward, but whether this was wrong or would take anything away from the tournament. Well, this was quite the pickle. I was actually backstage when these tournaments were going on and when the decision was made. And I heard from a number of MLG employees, blah blah blah, this, and this. And it was pretty much what came out in the MLG statement. That's what was said. So, I didn't see any evidence, but I heard it from a bunch of MLG guys that should have really known. And I don't really necessarily have a reason to disbelieve them. The problem is I don't necessarily have a reason to disbelieve Curse or Dignitas either. So, there are a couple of arguments that could be made. The first one was that they weren't going to play seriously because they wanted to hide strats and builds for the regionals, which were at PAX next week and had a higher prize pool, and they were scared of TSM. TSM is Team Solo Mid, they kind of own face. Is that okay? Well, arguably yes. I mean, you don't have to break out your super secret builds in a competitive tournament. The problem is, if both teams don't want to do that, then you end up in a situation where both teams are not necessarily playing at 100%. If they conspire not to show builds, then, as far as I'm concerned, that is unsportsmanlike. They are not competing to the fullest possible for this particular tournament. And if they don't want to compete to the fullest, if you don't want to play properly, then I say go home and don't compete in the tournament. TSM did not compete in the tournament, and they won the regionals. If it was their intention to hide builds, then they did so in the right way, by not attending MLG in the first place. Now, when this first happened, there were accusations of match fixing. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to say that they were fixing deliberately, because when it comes down to the points that you would have gained in order to go on to the regionals from that event, it doesn't really benefit either team to actually be in first or second place anyway. So that's really a non-issue. But you can say that match fixing was going on if they determined not to play seriously to begin with. This is not necessarily saying, oh, well, we're going to let Dignitas or we're going to let Curse win. It's neither of us are going to really play reasonably, and as a result, whatever happens, happens. One could define that as, say, match fixing by proactive negligence, deliberately not playing to win. That, as far as I'm concerned, is against the competitive spirit. Now, the all-random, all-mid. Now, this is what caused a lot of drama. What basically happened is, in the first match of their best-of-5 series, they decided to play an all-random, all-mid, which is all players just randoming a hero, and then all fighting in the middle, and playing by what is essentially a set of gentleman's rules. This is actually an official rule set that you can play if you happen to pick the Proving Grounds map and set all random in the custom game settings. It's quite fun, we play it quite a lot with the guys on the stream. But it's not exactly suitable for a competitive match. It would be like saying the first in the best of 7 for the StarCraft 2 final should be a mono battle or a game of Battlecraft or Nexus Wars. It's silly. Is it okay to have a silly game in the grand finals? Probably not. Some would argue that the crowd was loving it, but as far as I could tell, they were a little bit lukewarm and bemused. Some people thought it was cool, some people didn't. The casters certainly didn't. That was blindingly obvious. They couldn't even believe that it was actually happening, and of course it caused a lot of drama. At the end of the day, it's a 35 million or so player game with a fairly hefty esports scene. The last thing you want to be doing is screwing around in the grand finals. MLG did not say that it was the reason for the disqualification. No, no, no. It was all about the whole agreeing to split the prize money. And this is where the discussion really comes down to. Is it okay to split the prize money? I say no. Because, as far as I'm concerned, once again, play properly or go home. If you're not willing to play seriously, you shouldn't be playing at all. If you split the prize money, if that is what you agree to do, then you are, by very definition, not playing seriously. You could say, oh, well, they're playing competitively anyway, right? For the honor, for the pride. No, especially not if you ARAM in the first match. You're blatantly not doing it for that. What you are doing is simply going through the motions to provide what would otherwise be a mediocre final, and then you both walk away with a substantial pot of money. The motivation of the cash prize simply is not there anymore. And yes, it does affect the caliber of play. This is all linked into the idea that they didn't want to show their builds and strats to TSM for the regionals the week afterwards. If you are not playing to win, then you don't have to bust out your best builds. And that's the real problem, isn't it? You're in Major League Gaming's Grand League of Legends final, with like 200,000 plus concurrent viewers. It's being promoted by Riot, it's being promoted by MLG, it is a very large and prominent League of Legends tournament. If you are not playing to win in the grand finals, you shouldn't be in them, period. That's for any game, it doesn't matter which. League of Legends is in a somewhat immature state in regards to its esports scene. You have an esports scene that's essentially been bought and paid for. Riot has put a lot of money into it. A lot of money. And I don't think people necessarily realize how much money Riot really has. They're flush, seriously flush. They are owned by an extremely wealthy Chinese company. They can throw money at this and essentially create an esports scene out of thin air. And as a result, it's grown very fast. And it's going through some growing pains. It's got problems, and people are doing stupid crap. And this, I think, is that all coming to a head, a very big and obvious incident. It's something that they need to smooth out and ensure does not happen again, and make sure people realize, well, this is competitive esports, there is money on the line, you are expected to compete seriously. What I will say, though, in terms of MLG, is that their statement did not provide any evidence. And I think that if they have evidence, they should most assuredly present it to the public to quell any more drama. Because let's be honest, this drama is not good for anyone, even if they're not involved in the league scene. This just tarnishes esports in general, and quite frankly, that sucks for everybody. Okay, folks, that's me done for the day. Thank you very much for watching the Mailbox, and I'll see you next time.